Thank you all for joining us for another installment of Wild at Work, a Stewardship series. Joining us today, we have Associate Professor and Extension Wildlife Specialist for Texas A&M Rangeland Wildlife and Fisheries Management Department, Dr. John Tomecek. Dr. Tomecek will be discussing current and upcoming methods of managing feral hogs through chemical control and how to incorporate chemical control into the integrated pest management approach. We do ask that participants remain muted with their cameras off for the remainder of the presentation. If there are any questions, feel free to use the chat function on Zoom, and hopefully we'll have a chance to tackle those at the end. We do want to make a note that Dr. Tomecek is on a bit of a tight schedule, so he'll have to be jumping off our call at right at 1 p.m. So we'll hopefully have a chance to tackle some of those, but if not, that's okay, and we can learn from his PowerPoint alone. So with that, Dr. Tomecek, I can go ahead and hand the reins off to you. If you want to share your screen, I'll stop sharing mine here.
All right, Jared, I appreciate that very much. Thanks everybody for logging in today. Just a couple of moments. Let me get this loaded up. If you'll just be patient with me, and let's see if I can actually share, Jared. How does that look?
Yeah, it looks good. I can see your screen there.
Perfect. Excellent. Y'all forgive me. I got a bit of allergy, so I may cough a little bit today. So I'm glad to be invited, glad to present here today talking about new fronts in the battle with feral hogs, which I always like to say, hey, pigs are the gift that keeps on giving. And it goes both ways. We have new control approaches, new management approaches, but we also have new problems that we're dealing with all the time. And that's just the nature of pigs, I'm afraid. So with that being said, I'm going to go over some old familiar material today because I think repetition is important in learning, and then talk about kind of where we are with some items, where we are with new chemical control approaches, and then what items are upcoming in the future for us. If you heard me speak last year at the TWA meeting in San Antonio in July, then some of this will be a repetition, some of it will be new, but just bear with me because, again, it's never bad to hear that stuff more than once. So again, and I'm just going to go ahead and put all my pieces up. You'll hear people say feral hog, you'll hear people say wild pig, feral swine, and a lot of that has to do with who you're talking to. But I want to be clear that when we talk about these animals, we're talking about the same basic thing, just multiple words to call it what it is. It is an animal that is descended of both, at least in Texas, descended of Eurasian wild boar that were released for hunting, as well as domestic pigs that were either released or escaped from domestic operations, and the hybrids of those two things, which are the same species, y'all. Wild boar are simply the wild animal that we domesticated pigs from many thousands of years ago. How did we end up with pigs in Texas? There's a little bit of everything in this, right? It's a little column A, little column B. The Spanish brought pigs with them back in the conquistador days. There were people that brought pigs with them when they were settling in the early 1800s in that wave of early Anglo settlement, like Austin's colony. And remember that the pig is an animal that humans bred to be largely self-sufficient. It's highly defensive. It's very reproductively successful. So it's great when you're in an area where the frontier is a little wild and you need to spend your time trying to survive, not worrying about if your livestock are going to make it or not. So those historic origins in Texas lead us to the 20th century, where we saw pig numbers really expand in the later half of the 20th century, and certainly the early 21st century, they've blown up. And that has a lot to do both with natural population growth, just the numbers as they work out over time, pig populations growing, as well as people putting them on trailers and moving them around. And to talk about this enough in Texas, we've got over half the pigs that exist in the United States here in Texas. It's a thing that I don't know we should be proud of, but it is what it is. But they have grown in their numbers nationwide and worldwide. This is a global problem, and it touches every continent except Antarctica. And even if you're in the native range of the wild boar, numbers are growing and issues are growing. The thing we have to remember in Texas is that public perception on pigs is pretty diverse. Some people hate them, some people love them, some people think they should love them. One of the things that we've learned in research over the years most was that increasingly folks believe that pigs are from here, they're native to Texas, and they have a reason and a right to be here. Let me be clear with you. Pigs are not native to the Western Hemisphere. We're not talking about peccaries, javelina. That's a different animal altogether. I know it looks like a pig, but it's not. We're talking about animals from the genus Sus, which are all of our historic pigs, domestic livestock, wild boar, as well as the old world pigs. they don't belong here. The ecosystem didn't evolve for them. They don't fit well in it, and they really strain our management of our landscapes for native wildlife and livestock production. So public perception is pretty varied on pigs, mostly due to how folks interact with them. If you're a farmer and all you experience is damage, you hate them. If you're a hunter that lives in an urban area and the only interaction you have is that enjoyment that you get by hunting them, maybe you feel okay about them. But I hope by the end of today's talk, you realize that we don't have any good reason to keep pigs around. So again, just definitions that I think are important, and especially for today's talk. In Texas anyway, this animal is considered free-ranging domestic livestock, which means the landowner owns them when they stand on your land. Now, every state in the U.S. handles them a little bit differently. Many states consider them livestock as we do, but California, for example, considers them wildlife. They are listed along with every other native game animal, and they've got protections that are related to that. So don't assume just because you're in another state that they handle them the same way that Texas does. But remember, here in Texas, they're free-roaming domestic livestock, which is convenient because if Jared and I are neighbors and pigs come from my place, they go through the fence and they damage Jared's property. Those were Jared's pigs when they did the damage. Those weren't my pigs, right? But when they're standing on my land, I can choose how I want to manage them on my land. Just to give you a little bit of a national perspective, because I feel like we often forget it, here's where pigs were at a county level in 2022. The 2023 map should be up any day now if it's not already. I just haven't updated this. Not a lot of changes on that new map, but this is where pigs stood in 2022. So most of the southeastern U.S., California, of course, Hawaii's had pigs for 1,200 years that native Hawaiians brought them. But I want to point out the little blip in North Dakota. We're starting to see incursions over the border with Canada from Eurasian wild boar that were farmed in Saskatchewan and Alberta and are coming over the border and invading. And you may have heard about the Canadian super pig and all that. The reality is, guys, it's just a wild boar in a cold climate, so it gets a little bigger. But the point I want to make is that although we have feral hogs in the warm parts of the U.S., they actually don't perform at peak capabilities in the warm weather. Peak performance for them occurs in colder climates. So as bad as pigs are for us, they could be a lot worse. Now, I want to give you a little bit of an insight into the economics of Texas pigs, as well. When we look at economics in Texas, it's kind of hard to wrap our minds around. And so there's a lot of little numbers on this. Forgive my lines didn't quite line up. But we've got many millions of dollars of damage. There's an old number that still floats around that says, oh, they do $52 million a year in damage in Texas. That number was old in the 90s, right? But it's hard to get figures. So these numbers come from the USDA research project on economics of wild pigs. This is what we know about in terms of damages today on feral hogs. It's probably a lot more than this, but I like to point out vehicular accidents, $59 million. If you want good math on something, go to an insurance company. Your insurance company knows exactly how much they spend on claims related to deer accidents, pig accidents, etc. That's an awful lot of money in vehicles damaged by hitting cars or by hitting pigs. What we assume, based on everything else we know, is that the total damages per year in Texas are probably somewhere in the ballpark of $500 million a year. And I'd like to point out that does not include wildlife damage. Crops not listed here, right? Minority crops. It doesn't include natural resources damage like grazing lands. It doesn't consider what the decrease in your stocking rates had to be for your cattle because of the damage to your rangeland from pigs. And it doesn't consider ecosystem services like the filtration of water in the Middle Trinity River due to the water coming out of the Metroplex, the wastewater system going through the Middle Trinity, and that land cleaning it. Pigs interrupting that. We don't consider any of those things because we don't know how to calculate that. But $500 million a year is a lot of money. What does that mean? It's often hard with these big numbers, at least for me, to wrap my head around what it actually means. So I like to use examples. $500 million a year is larger than it's about the same size as the timber industry in Texas. This is an incredible slog to us economically, and we don't even know about this other stuff. So there's somewhere in the ballpark of 3.5 or 4 million pigs in Texas. That number's tricky and it's hard to get our arms around. but that's more than there are domestic pigs of all kinds, show pigs, meat pigs, etc., and sheep and goats put together in this state. There are more pigs than there are domestic swine, sheep, and goats in Texas. There's about the same number of pigs that there are white-tailed deer, and those are the most conservative estimates of pigs we can put together. So if I were to show you the real boundaries on that number, you'd realize I'm giving you the low end of what they could be. We have no reasonable economic incentive for keeping pigs around. I don't think in my lifetime we're going to eradicate pigs. I just don't think it's going to happen. But I think we have the ability to drive pig numbers down. I don't think they're ever going to go away as far as hunting is concerned, but there's no reasonable economic situation for us to say, oh, keeping pigs around is fine, doesn't cause any problems. So we're here to talk today about chemical control. So we talk about methods of aerial shooting, trapping, ground shooting, including, working at night with thermals and night vision, running snares, using dogs. Those are all established methods of chemical control, or of control for pigs in Texas. Now, I always emphasize that we talk about legal methods of control when I do these talks. The reason I talk about legal methods of control is as soon as I don't, somebody will message me after a talk, come up to me if it's in person, and they'll say, well, you didn't talk about this, but I know a great way to kill pigs. And it is definitely not legal because you're using, normally, someone tells me about a chemical you can use, and it is definitely not approved for that by the EPA and the Texas Department of Ag, which means that if it is a pesticide at all, you're going off label, which is illegal. And you're probably doing things with that aren't really quite right or aren't supposed to be done, or they have other risks. So we don't talk about those. We talk about legal methods. So everything I'm going to talk about today is a method that is either currently legal or is on the horizon or is being worked on. So what about chemical control? And I believe I have a slide in here that I needed to take out. Forgive me, I'm going to have to flip by it. Yep, that's that slide. Ignore that one. As of today, there is a legal toxicant for pigs in Texas. That was my holding slide to say there's none. Today there is. So what about chemical control? So when we talk about chemical control options broadly, and we're thinking about an ideal chemical control, what makes a good option? It's four things. Well, three really, and four is a consideration. It's safe, it's humane, and it's effective. These are the things when we talk about pesticides in general for all animals, all insects, all everything, safe, humane, and effective. This is what the industry that works on those chemicals will tell you. And safe means two things. One is safe for us to handle and be around, and it's also safe for non-target animals in whatever way we exclude them from it. And that's important to talk about because if it's safe for us to handle or to be around, how can it be harmful to the animals that we want to ingest it and die from it? That could be, but well, we're just not susceptible to it. Or it could be, well, we are susceptible to it, but we have procedures and processes to keep us safe. Perfect. And it needs to be humane. These animals die, but we're not mad at them, right? It's just a process we have to go through. But humaneness has a lot of criteria for folks to evaluate and decide what's humane and what's not. And realistically, that's a judgment call. One person's definition of humane is not another person's definition of humane. Either way, the goal is for it to be minimally effective on the animal in a negative way or an injurious way before they expire. You want it to be effective. So I can easily give you a tool that is safe for us, safe for animals, humane, but it's not effective. Water. Water's great. Water is not toxic, at least most of the time, and it's safe and it's humane to give to anything, but it's not effective. It's not going to do what we want. And so we want that chemical control item option to be effective at the highest level it can be, while being as humane as it can be, while being as safe as it can be. And just like anything in life, there's no such thing as a perfect tool. This is the idea we have for ourselves to help us work towards better things. What about cost? So if you read the literature on chemical control, they'll say, well, look, we have this ideal of safe, humane, and effective. Cost really shouldn't be a consideration. If you could make it as safe as it could be, as humane as it could be, and as effective as it could be, cost shouldn't matter. The reality is cost matters. Cost matters for all of us. We can create the perfect tool, but it will never see use if it's not cost effective. But again, This is a judgment call. What's cost effective for me and what's cost effective for Jared may be two very different things. That has a lot to do with our economics, the economics of our property, and what other control measures we have used, are using, and can use. Because remember, not every place and time will be right for chemical control. You may be in a situation where you say, well, I'd love to use it, but where I am, I just can't do it. I'll use other tools as an example. Aerial gunning is a highly effective tool. Not a problem. There are a lot of pigs in urban San Antonio. I do not foresee us aerial gunning pigs in San Antonio. There's a whole lot of reasons for not doing it, but I think we can all agree that's not going to happen, even though the tool would work fine. So cost has got to be a factor. Safe, humane, effective, and we're interested in cost. These are always balancing acts for us with every tool. So as I talk through tools today and as I talk through the pros and cons, because nothing is perfect in life, think about it in these kinds of contexts. Is it safe? Is it humane? Is it effective? And remember, a lot of those are personal judgment calls for you to make about whether or not it's right for you, right for your operation, and right for your management ethic. Because at the end of the day, it's your land and your decisions on how to make management decisions. All right, so this is the one everybody wants to know about, so I'm going to spend most of my time talking about this, and forgive me, my slides are about a month out of date, so there are some things that I needed to update. That last bullet says in process with TDA. It is now approved by TDA and registered for use in Texas. So we're going to start with toxicants. I'm going to talk about also contraceptives and other things today. This is the first toxicant we're going to talk about. It is called Kaput feral hog bait. If you've been to the farm and ranch supply store, you've seen other Kaput products, Kaput mole bait, Kaput rat bait, Kaput gopher bait, etc. It's made by a company called Symmetrics out of Colorado, and it was registered originally with the EPA back in 2017. And you may remember this. So warfarin has been around. It's a warfarin-based product. Warfarin's been around since the 1940s as an anticoagulant rodenticide, meaning that it doesn't allow the body to heal bleeds. It doesn't allow clots to form, and animals expire usually by a bleed in the brain. So this has been around as a rodenticide since the 1940s. It's also used in human medicine as a blood thinner, and warfarin was the first generation of these anticoagulant pesticides. Most of what we see now when we think about rat baits and rodent baits that are anticoagulants, most of those are second and third generation anticoagulants. Coumadin is a good example. So if you're on a dose of something for a blood thinner, you might actually be on warfarin. Chances are it's something like a Coumadin. And those next generation anticoagulants are far more efficacious at doing what they do, far more of an anticoagulant than the warfarin was. So this is a warfarin-based pesticide. It is a tenth of the concentration of what's available in commercial rat baits, so 10% of the warfarin than what you feed to rats at what you can go buy at the farm and ranch supply store or Walmart. You go buy it off the shelf. So this got an EPA registration very quickly in early 2017, and the reason for that was warfarin was already registered as a rodenticide, and EPA simply added feral swine to it, to that registration as a new species. As you will remember, at that time, Texas Department of Agriculture was moving to register it in Texas, and there was, we're going to call it, a lot of legislative interest. There were folks that had a lot of questions, and I think we all did back then, because this got an EPA registration in a matter of mere weeks, whereas it normally takes months. Everyone was caught off guard. There were questions that we all needed to answer, and the manufacturer was working on those things. And we all were in this question asking phase, and things happened. At that time, the product's registration application was pulled, and we all essentially stood down for a few years. In 2021, the 87th Texas Legislature came to Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, myself and Mike Bodenchuk with Texas Wildlife Services, and asked us to conduct a 2-year field evaluation, a field trial of that product to see if we could find efficacy with it. Would it work? Would it make a difference for landowners in their efforts to control feral hogs? And would it work across the state and throughout the year? And that was a good question, because the antidote to warfarin is vitamin K. Vitamin K is available and abundant in green growing plants in the springtime. It's one of the reasons that turkeys highly select greens in that early springtime period because they need vitamin K for a variety of things. So this was a good question. So we did a 2-year study that was in every ecoregion of the state throughout every season of the year. We were in the swamps, we were in the thorn scrub, we were in the mountains, we were in the prairies, we were everywhere for 2 years running this and observing how it worked. So this product was applied by private pesticide applicators on private land at the behest of the legislature. And we observed people following kind of our best practices for application to see if it would work. And the answer is it worked. We had it throughout the seasons of the year, throughout the state. We were able to significantly reduce feral hog numbers as long as people followed our instructions for how best to apply the product. And so now it is fully registered for use in Texas. That registration was effective as of the 1st of this month. And we expect the manufacturer is moving along with getting it to distribution and sales. Don't know exactly when that's going to be, but we're told sometime this spring, probably around April. So I'm sure you have lots of questions about everything we did and how it worked. So let me tell you about it. So our overview for the 2 years we spent working on this product, again, I already said the legislature asked us to do it, and there were two things that they essentially focused in on. Can the product be effective around the state of Texas, recognizing the diverse environments and ecosystems we have and diverse kinds of agriculture as well? And does this product actually make a difference for landowners using it? Okay, so will it work? Yeah, it can work, but does it make a difference? The big hitch was we had to be private applicators on private lands, no government people doing it. When real world, real people do it, not researchers, can it work? So I'm not going to bore you with the design, but you might be saying, well, how do you know, John? So there were feeders that are designated to be used with the product in the label. I show one of them here in the upper photo. And these are guillotine-style doors that are weighted to keep non-targets out of it, and they have a lift bar to keep non-targets from lifting it any other way. And they're filled up. You can fill them with about 300 pounds of bait total. So what we did, because you've got to train animals to use things, we had a process not dissimilar from trapping, where you start with corn with the doors pinned open, and then you slowly move to closing the doors halfway, and you start mixing in placebo. This is not dissimilar from if you're starting deer or other ungulates that have never had protein feed before on protein, you have to introduce them to it slowly so they learn that it's something good to eat. Once they're eating it, great. So we slowly worked them up on the corn and the placebo till they were eating the placebo well. The door's half open, I'm going to talk about here more in just a moment, but that has a lot to do with training animals on how to open the doors. This is not intuitive, and they do not figure it out on their own with the doors shut. Once they were using the doors, we closed them all the way and filled up the feeder with, we say hot bait, it's toxic bait. So the label recommends baiting at least 3 weeks. I will say we ran this until there were no more pigs. And you may say, John, how do you know there were no pigs? So we used a device that we all refer to as a pig roller. You see on the bottom right, it's a PVC pipe with holes drilled in it. It's anchored to a T-post, and you fill it with corn, and pigs come in and they roll it around and they eat the corn that comes out, but it's a slow feed system. So this was our way of seeing, are there still pigs here and they're just disinterested in the bait, or are there no pigs? Because no pig alive is going to ignore free corn if they can get their hands on it. So we established sites with a feeder and a paired roller, and we had cameras watching these. 2 cameras on the feeder, 1 camera on the roller, so we could see every interaction that occurred. I'll also tell you I had 10 staff for 2 years doing nothing but looking at camera photos, and 600,000 camera photos later, we had a lot of data to say grace over. The upshot of it all is it does work. We got the product to work just fine. There was a story in some problems that we ran into that were mechanical, and I'm about to tell you about that. We learned a lot in this so that we were able to visit with the manufacturer as well as create educational resources that Extension will be putting out on kind of best approaches, the same way that we give you best application practices for chemical herbicides. So this product, if you haven't seen it before, haven't seen photos of it, there are these 1 inch by 1 inch by ½ inch blue cubes. They look like a wax-based cube. The blue is actually a blue dye. It's the same dye that you'll get in commercial baits that you go buy at the farm and ranch supply. which was developed a long time ago in an area of Southern California where they were trying to bait ground squirrels, and they were worried about folks living in impoverished communities eating the ground squirrels. Those weren't being baited with warfarin. They were being baited with something far more toxic that has a lot of secondary toxicity, which means that it not only poisons the animal, but enough stays around in that animal's body that whatever eats it will also be poisoned. So that blue dye dyes the animal's fat blue. And I've got photos for this. I'm sorry it's lunchtime, but we're wildlife people. So it dyes the animal's fat blue. What we didn't know is it actually will dye cartilage blue as well as synovial fluid, the fluid in your joints. And so it will end up dyeing the bones blue in those joints. And you can see quite a long time after that animal's expired and been scavenged that in fact it died from this toxicant. The thing I want to emphasize is that this is an extremely low toxicity formulation. There's so little warfarin in this that it only barely counts as a toxic product per EPA. So when we started using it, we were curious about would that be enough to actually do anything, which is the question about, okay, will this product actually work? The thing about warfarin is that as a chemical, it metabolizes extremely quickly. It doesn't stay around. So you don't see much residue in the kidneys or the liver like you would get with next generation anticoagulants that you might see in news articles about stuff going on in California with large carnivores. Those are different chemicals being used. This is extremely low dose, extremely low residue in meat and in organ tissues, almost nothing left. There's a good veterinary literature on that subject if you're interested. So what we know from pen trials conducted by the manufacturer and by USDA folks is that it takes about 5 or 6 pounds of this bait to kill a pig, which really comes down to about half a pound a night for 5 or 6 nights. This is not an acute toxicant, meaning that you have to be dosed for several nights to develop a lethal load. The advantage of that is that if for some reason, which we never had, but if you had a non-target get access to the bait, you shut down the bait station, it is so unlikely that that animal will have received a toxic dose in a single feeding that you have an ability to correct that problem. We're going to talk about another toxicant here in a minute that is an acute toxicant that non-targets access, and that quick toxicity is a problem. Pigs really seem to like this stuff. I'll be honest with you, I called the manufacturer at a point to ask him what he put in it because they really like this bait. So the only times that we had issues getting pigs to actually take the bait were when there were heavy crops of acorns on the ground, or when we had peanuts on the ground ready, or in the ground ready for harvest. I can't get a pig in a trap those times. I can't compete with that food. But the rest of the time, the pigs were very excited to eat it. After you start feeding them and they start eating the toxic bait, it takes about 6 to 8 days for carcasses to start to appear because pigs start dying. And we would find these carcasses on the landscape, usually not that far from the feeder. Many of them we would find along trails as if they just fell over. Some we would find in brushed up areas as though they laid down. This dye stays in pig systems for about 18 days. So if you had an animal that got a sublethal dose for some reason, you would know 18 days later that it had gotten a dose of the stuff. So the blue dye is there long after the chemical is out of an animal's system. I will say in our project, we never had animals that had non-lethal dosing. Everything that started eating the bait died from it. We came in afterwards and removed pigs in the area, if there were any left, to sample them for blue dye. And we've had a lot of questions about secondary toxicity. It's important to note that we did not evaluate secondary toxicity. We weren't asked to do that. The legislature didn't fund us doing that. But based on veterinary literature and the chemistry of this stuff, secondary toxicity is extraordinarily unlikely. We did not see any issues with scavengers that consume these carcasses. So I talked about the blue dye. I want to show you here what that blue dye looks like in practice. So the photo on the top left and the photo in kind of the middle center of that piglet that's belly is facing you, those animals were found so fresh by us that rigor mortis had not really set in yet. The piglet, it's a little bit, but not much. You can see one person still holding a hoof up. This is how blue that stuff is. And it starts to show up in fat and in joints really just an hour or two after they start ingesting their first dose of the bait. So it metabolizes fast, it stays in that tissue, and you can see it. Remember, the dye is not toxic. It's a non-toxic substance, and it's just there as a marker so you know these animals fed on this stuff. I'll also tell you that before you even cut an animal open, if it is a light colored pig, you can actually see the blue dye through the cartilage in the ear. So delivery systems, again, all of this is on the label, which is now available because the product is labeled for use. The bait has to be applied in an approved feeder with a weighted door. And we measured the force of all of these doors to make sure they were 17 pounds of force, which is what EPA says they have to be. And you may say, John, is that enough? That's not John's opinion. The EPA decided and TDA decided what these things needed to be. This prevents and deters non-target species from accessing the bait. And I will tell you, in all of our experiences, all of our trial sites and feeders all over the state, 600,000 photos later, we never had a non-target species access the bait when the doors were shut. We never had a non-target access toxic bait. We did have non-targets get into placebo, but the bait matrix, once you start using the blocks, either the placebo or the toxic bait, we didn't see much interest from anything other than pigs and the occasional raccoon. Nothing else really showed an interest in the stuff. We had javelinas that were sleeping around the feeder and hanging out around it while pigs were eating, and they did not show much interest in it. I will say, though, that this stuff really does need to be securely anchored. Even though we didn't see a lot of interest on the part of non-targets, it is still your obligation as an applicator by federal and state law to prevent non-targets from getting it. And I'm going to show you photos exactly what I mean about securing this stuff. But one of the issues we run into is that pigs, they're messy feeders. They eat and they crumble bait. But what we found is that they clean up the crumbles, so much so that you actually see them start to get under the feeder and clear out soil underneath it, which destabilizes it, and you have to go back and restabilize the feeder. I will say, in terms of the delivery system, there were technical modifications that we did to it, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute, to make it more effective and more useful in the field. Those are common things that anybody can do themselves, but also the manufacturer tells us will be included in new feeders that they make. So the key takeaway for us that I'm going to repeat again and again is that it was effective statewide. It was effective in all seasons when applied diligently. But I want to say diligently. The issues we had when folks didn't apply it well were that they didn't kill pigs. If you followed the instructions on the label and you followed our best practices, you killed pigs. We had some applicators that had significant reductions in damage in pig presence. We had some folks that had pigs gone for many months before a new group came in. Tracking those results over the course of a year, we had some places where folks saw pig numbers go down by 90%. That's great, but you have to be diligent. It requires work, it requires effort, it requires time and money. And I mentioned feeder modifications were required to confer success. I've got a slide on that I think is next. We didn't detect any non-target access or issues of concern. We didn't see problems with non-targets. We didn't find dead non-targets. All we ever saw were pigs eating the bait. Now, that being said, the delivery system is the key to that, key to keeping other stuff out of it. And mechanical devices are just that. They're mechanical, they need maintenance. You do not buy anything on your operation and expect it to last forever, and pigs aren't careful with stuff. The biggest issue was with the doors getting jammed or stuck open. The simplest solution to this, you can see in this diagram here, the bottom two photos show that door in the track. Use a pry bar and open that track up. Jokingly, what I've told folks is what it is it's something built like an AR-15 type machining tolerances. You wanted an AK-47. You wanted something that rattles when you shake it, but it goes bang every time. So we use pry bars to open those tracks up. What you will have in moist environments, wet environments, is moisture will collect in that pan where the feed goes into. Now, if pigs are eating regularly, this is not an issue. But if for some reason it sits without use, that bait will get soggy and it will disintegrate. Putting drain holes in it is not a bad idea. You also will get clogging in the feed if too much bait is deployed. So the feed of the feeder, if you will. So it just means be diligent in filling that feeder, but don't fill it all the way up to the top so that it doesn't jam. Same as we get with some deer feeders. You see bodies cracking from weather and use and stress. You see that here. Guys, it's a mechanical device. If you can tack weld it back together, great. At some point, it's going to wear out and you're going to have to buy a new feeder. Now, I will say that we had rooting issues under the feeder, which is my only situation where I worry about non-target access. Let me show you that. This is what I mean. As the pigs start to clean up the bait that they spill or that they crumble, they start to make that feeder list, if you will. Now, this is a spot that is in deep sugar sand, so it's going to happen fast. If you're checking on that feeder, making sure it's stable, that's all great. It should be fine. It's anchored with 4 T-posts, but depending on the environment, this can happen, which at night turns into this, where the feeder is now on its side and the door is slid open. That would be a non-target access problem that you would need to fix. You can get enterprising about it. If you're on rocky country and it's anchored and it's not moving, fine. If you're in sand, you probably want to be careful about how you anchor it. We've had folks put sheets of plywood down. We had folks get a few bags of Quickcrete and pour a little foundation to put it on. Whatever works for you, just make sure that you are keeping that feeder stable. Now, I want to point out, you see the small sections of fence panel here. That's not an application need. This was for us in the project. We put these panels up to show us, you can see the camera in the background, and of course you're looking from one camera. This was for us to not double count pigs because we had to look at both sets of photos at the same time. This is just a visual aid for us. In application in the field, you don't need that fencing. All right, so baiting modifications. One thing that we ran into as well, which again is now just a known fact and the manufacturers incorporated it, we added a half open stage for pre-baiting. So when we started, we opened it all the way, got pigs to eat, and then closed it, and then the pigs didn't know how to open the door to feed. Nothing would. So a very wise trapper said, you know, that door from closed to open is about 7 inches. You know, the long side of a 2x4 is 3.5. So he put it in, drilled a new hole. Lo and behold, the pigs learned to use it. So they could see the bait, they could get their nose in, but in order to eat, they had to lift the door. After a handful of days like that, they got used to feeding out of it. We closed the door all the way, and they learned how to use it. We also had folks that would grease that door track. I even had one enterprising farmer that drilled and tapped and put Zerk fittings in so he could just grease it when he went by and checked on it every day. Great. None of that would be a label violation. You're going above and beyond making that product more well-maintained, if you will. And when we talk about that half stop stage, you see on the left-hand side, this is that 3.5 inch half open. It was piece of or 2x4, power drill, and we're off to the races. So again, just to reiterate this, guys, what made it work? The most successful applicators really invested time in good conditioning. That process can take up to 3 weeks prior to putting toxic bait out. It is not dissimilar from corral style trapping where you've got to make sure that pigs are well trained before you decide to set that thing to catch. The other thing is make sure those feeders are never empty. You know this if you're used to baiting pigs or anything else to hunt. If they know that food resource is going to be there, they're going to come back to it. You have to get them eating this stuff every night consistently. So the label says check the feeders every 2 to 4 days. This is good reasoning for you don't want to run the pigs off by being there too much. But I will tell you, frankly, pigs get used to you being there. We had pigs that would sleep around the feeder. We would come up to fill the feeders. They would walk away. Feeders would get filled up and they'd come right back and eat. That's what you want. You want them so comfortable that they're sleeping around it. We have photos of pigs nursing piglets next to the feeder. They're very comfortable. But when you check it at first, you need to go every day because they will clean out that feeder every night. 100 pounds of bait, 200 pounds of bait, whatever. Even though they only need half a pound per pig per day, you can't meter it out like that. As the process goes on, you'll get to have a feeling for how often you need to go out. Maybe later in the process, every 3 or 4 days is okay. Whatever you do, though, you don't want to scare them off. The places that we didn't have a lot of luck often involved applicators getting frustrated by looking at pigs every day and eventually shooting at those pigs. And then those pigs never come back. You know how this works. You're used to hunting pigs. You've got to make them comfortable just like you do in a trap before you set to catch, which in this case is putting out toxic bait. So again, what made it fail? Some places didn't have pigs. That happens. We had to adjust and go to a different spot. I mentioned acorns and peanuts already. You can't compete with alternative feed sources that are preferred. But inconsistent baiting, lack of conditioning, and harassing pigs at the bait sites, those things you can avoid. You don't have to do that. So again, takeaways, the product has the capacity to work. It requires time, money, and work. It's only effective when you have constant effort by an applicator. This is no different from any other herbicide that we use, other pesticide. I like to use Sendero as an example. Sendero works great if you apply it right. If you don't apply it right, it doesn't work great. It'll do some, but it's not what it could be. So make sure that you follow the label and be mindful of non-targets. Even though we did not have issues in our trials, that doesn't exempt you from responsibility. The other thing that we want to point out, and I use this photo here, it's not from our project, but a few of our producers in the project pointed out, look, when you're doing this and we're baiting pigs and they're dying in a time when we've got calves dropping and a lot of vultures here, we might be creating problems for ourselves. So that's something to be mindful of because the vultures stacked in the areas that the carcasses were coming up. All right, I'm going to shift gears. Again, I spent a lot of time on that. In the remaining time, we're going to talk about a couple of other toxicant and contraceptive ideas. So you're probably also familiar with the sodium nitrite-based toxicant, trade name of Hoggon, that's been in trials with USDA and TPWD for a little over a decade now. So this does not have a label in the United States, but it is actually currently labeled in Australia and New Zealand where it was developed. This research that was done showed high efficacy in evaluations in Texas and Alabama. So this product, its mode of action is that it strips red blood cells of oxygen. So it converts hemoglobin into methemoglobin, and you essentially fall asleep and die in your sleep. It is an acute toxicant, meaning that you do not have to eat it for several days. You can get a single lethal dose, go walk away and die. The problem with that came in the form of non-target issues. So pigs don't eat cleanly. Pigs would eat this bait, crumble this bait, and then in cases in both Texas and Alabama, migratory birds came in, upland game birds came in, they ate the bait, and they died en masse around the feeders. So you had migratory passerines, you had wild turkeys dying, and despite USDA's efforts over the years, they never managed to fix this problem. So in the last field trial that happened in 2023, after that failure to prevent non-targets, they essentially went back to the drawing board. So this one right now has been put on hold by USDA, despite all of the research that was done. The product works, not a question of the product. It's the non-target issue. You've got to solve that before EPA will work with it. So most of this comes down to the issue that pigs will feed on the stuff, crumble it, and then non-targets get the crumbles. It wasn't access problems in the feeder device or any of that. Similar feeders to what we had with the Kaput product. So Louisiana State University's Ag Center, which is their version of AgriLife, has developed a different matrix essentially to put the bait in that has the consistency more of like a gummy bear or a marshmallow where it holds its shape. So there is discussion right now about could USDA and LSU work together to get these products essentially to market perhaps by taking advantage of the process that USDA has already gone through, which is a decades-long process to go through field evaluations, find efficacy, and get it to market, whereas LSU is just starting out in their journey. I want to point out, though, you're going to look at this and say, oh, sodium nitrite. John, I can get on Amazon right now and I can buy a barrel of it because it's a food preservative used in meat, often used in bacon. And the irony of that is lost on nobody, especially not John. But the problem is this stuff is a sodium. It's extremely salty. If you were to take just a little bit of it and put it to your tongue, you would have a revolting reaction to it. You know, get it off, get it off. It is difficult to get animals to eat much of this stuff, except in the form that's been developed by this manufacturer, where they microencapsulate it essentially in peanut or peanut butter. So it tastes like peanut butter to the animals. They don't get that salty taste, so they're willing to eat enough of it to kill themselves. So we have questions about the future of this product in the US. An awful lot of research has been done, but it's not to the stage that it's ready for EPA registration yet. And again, this is the guide from the folks that developed the sodium nitrite product, this Hoggon. And I put this chart up, this flow chart, to show you that no matter what toxicant you end up using, the process is not very different from what I described for Kaput. You get pigs in there, you bait them with, they say, grain. So bait them in with corn, bait them in with corn, get the lid open, get them used to it, get the placebo in there, get them used to it. and then move to toxic bait. No matter what product you're going to end up using one day, it is still a training process to get pigs used to a product, get them to take the product in the amounts you need them to take to kill them, and then they die from it. So I want to touch on contraceptives real quick because folks always ask me, John, what about a contraceptive? What about a contraceptive? It's a great idea, guys. One day, someone will come up with a pig-specific contraceptive that doesn't affect anything else, and we will have a real change in our management of pigs globally. Because there's a lot of places that I can't shoot, and I can't trap, and I can't even use a toxicant, but a contraceptive I could use. There isn't a contraceptive that is pig-specific on the market right now. I'm going to talk about Hogstop here briefly, but Auburn University worked for many years on a genetically tailored pig contraceptive such that it could be added to a feed, like a pellet feed. You could feed it, anything could eat it, but it would only inhibit reproduction in sows. That's the dream. We're not there yet. The problem is we have contraceptives that will inhibit reproduction in sows. But those aren't pig specific. If I put them in a feed, it would inhibit reproduction in livestock, deer, everything that ate it. And then I could also dose those pigs by hand. But if I've caught a pig in a trap and I can dose it, normally I'm not going to do that. Normally I'm just going to go ahead and euthanize it in the trap. There is a product out right now called Hogstop, which you may have seen marketed, and it is marketed to reduce fertility in boars. Now, it is exempt from EPA registration under FIFRA, which is, again, alphabet soup I'm not going to go into, but FIFRA handles pesticides for rodents, fungus, insects, etc. And under FIFRA, this does not require EPA registration as a toxicant because it is a feed additive that's already approved that is naturally occurring. So its active ingredient is the gossypol in cottonseed oil. So back in the 1980s, when captive swine production, domestic swine production, was using whole cottonseed to feed boars, they found that those boars were not having great luck at reproduction. What it turned out is that the gossypol actually lowered sperm counts and sperm motility, so it made reproduction not as successful. So these folks say that if you feed this stuff in the field and boars eat it consistently, that they will have lower sperm count and motility. We conducted some pen trials of that last year in AgriLife, and we saw the same thing. You know, we put boars in captivity, fed them this stuff as much as they would eat, and then collected those boars. And yeah, sperm counts and motility go down as you feed the stuff. Will it be effective in the field? That remains to be seen. We've not seen a trial of it yet. I've not seen any data. But the reality is that most litters of pigs have multiple paternities, so those sows are being bred by more than one boar. And so it would take an awful lot of effort to get every boar on the landscape fed enough that they couldn't reproduce. Not saying it can't happen, but saying that we normally manage on the female side of the equation because of these things like multiple paternity. We normally target females for reproduction control. So this is the only thing that's out on the market right now as far as a contraceptive or reproductive inhibitor, but it's what we've got. So in the last little bit of time I've got, I want to hit some items, and I could spend all day on this, guys, but I like to talk about new frontiers and pig problems. And this is going to be some repetition of what I talked about last summer at the TWA meeting. But pigs are the gift that keeps on giving. We have disease issues that seem like we have a new problem every day just because we have pigs. And I've got a list of things here that I'm not going to go into necessarily, but we've got endemic diseases like pseudorabies and swine brucellosis. We've got foreign animal disease problems that we're dealing with in the future, like African swine fever. There's meat-borne parasites, etc. But I want to put on your radar some emerging issues, one of which is vampire bats and rabies. And really, this is the right audience for this talk because the greatest impact will probably be with the hunting public. So vampire bats exist Mexico and south. And they're a real source of concern for livestock raisers, for health and human safety due to rabies. In Mexico, oftentimes you just vaccinate your cattle for rabies because of the bats. Now we have these bats expanding their range northward. Now, cold winters we've had in the last few winters have actually pushed them back again. But in 2017, there was a bat that was caught in the pens at Reynosa on the border So we know that they're coming up. The concern is about the spread of rabies in feral hogs in Texas. And if you don't believe me, there's a photo of a bat feeding on a feral hog. Not in Texas, that's in Mexico. But the point here is, if we get rabies in vampire bats, if they feed on livestock in the South Texas rangelands, we can get producers vaccinating their cattle. It's an expense, but it's one that is done. USDA actually assists with that in Mexico now. But if it gets in feral hogs, what will that look like? I worry about a world in which we have rabid feral hogs out there on the landscape for two reasons. One, they might be more aggressive. If you know much about rabies, you go one of two ways with rabies. You either get hyper aggressive or you get very somnolent, you get very sleepy. But what is the pig that is more likely to be shot by a hunter? Is the pig that is out during the daytime, not feeling well and not avoiding hunters, get shot. And I worry about a hunter handling that pig carcass, getting exposed to rabies and not realizing it. And I'm sure everybody knows, but remember, we used to have a problem with rabies on the US-Mexican border. That's been under control for decades now. But this is a very real thing that could come up, and we could have human fatalities from folks exposed to rabies with pigs not knowing about it. And it is very unlikely that if it got started in pigs, that we would ever be able to stamp it out, not without a tremendous amount of effort. So this is one that I like to talk about because outreach to hunters on personal protective equipment to keep yourself safe already is essential with pigs, because y'all, pigs are nasty. They carry all kinds of diseases you and I can catch, but some of them, like this, would be fatal. So I want to talk about anthrax, and I love this photo because if you're in the part of the region, part of the state where anthrax is endemic, then you also don't have a lot of free water on the landscape. Most of your water comes from piped water. So remember, anthrax is a spore-based disease that is fatal to most animals, but amazingly not to pigs. As far as we know, it co-evolved with wild boar, and they're not susceptible to it. They do get it, but they won't die from it. It doesn't even make them all that sick. So recent research by USDA, and I mean this was hot off the presses last summer when I came to the TWA wildlife meeting, this shows that feral hogs with anthrax actually not only have it, but don't die from it, but their bodies allow them to produce more of it, more live spores. This means that if you have a pig on your ranch and it encounters anthrax, it will multiply, amplify that anthrax in its respiratory system. And as it roots in the ground on your ranch or other ranches, it spreads anthrax to new places. It spreads the spores, which means that that pig you didn't used to think was a big deal that came off your neighbor's place onto yours might now be bringing anthrax to your ranch. Or try this one on for size. You buy a load of pigs from somebody and release them. Now that's illegal, but y'all, I know it happens. You buy a load of pigs and you release them, and some of those pigs had anthrax, and you introduce anthrax to a part of the world that doesn't have it. That's a very real thing that can happen. So we know pigs are worse on anthrax than we expected, but this is very serious. So, not to beat a dead horse, but take that problem with pigs and let's take it one more step farther. This also was hot off the presses last year, and there's more work being done on it. Recent research between the USDA and the UT Health Science Center in Houston has indicated the ability of feral hogs to catch chronic wasting disease. There were pigs that were shot in North Texas. Their brains and nervous systems were shipped to the UT Health Science Center, and they extracted from them CWD prions, not porcine prions, not pig prions, which are a thing, right? But CWD prions. They had no neurological symptoms, but it was present in the adjacent tissues, so spinal cord, lymph nodes, etc. That means at a minimum, when a pig dies on the landscape that has encountered CWD and taken it up, that they will leave those prions in their body on the landscape where they die. Again, remember, moving pigs in trailers, this could be a problem. But what we don't know right now is if they can also spread CWD through their excreta, urine, feces, saliva, etc. That work is being done. We don't know that yet. But even at this basic level, and this was hot off the presses, we went ahead and got it out to you before it was even in a scientific journal because it matters to the manager. We have more reason than ever to remove feral hogs to protect wildlife, to protect property values, and to protect our operations and the way they do business. there is no good reason to keep pigs around, but it seems like every year goes by, there are more and more things that we learn about or new things that come in that are a problem with pigs. And I'm going to just say very quickly that we are concerned right now about the imminent threat of African swine fever. It is in the Caribbean. It has been the scourge of the old world. It is a disease that co-evolved with African warthogs. So great if you're in South Texas where we have warthogs, it won't kill the warthogs. It's spread through soft-bodied ticks and through contact between animals. If we get it here, one of the concerns is that it's going to rip through the feral hog population, which you may say, well, John, what do we care about that? But exposure to domestic pigs, exposure to show pigs will kill all of them. So it may be that John's retirement plan, if we get African swine fever, will be, I'm going to buy 1,000 pounds of bacon and freeze it and meter out a few packages a year because we won't have bacon anymore. That's an extreme example, and it's a little bit of an exaggeration. But to make the point, there is no cure or solution for African swine fever. The only solution that we're going to have, if it gets here, is to try to knock down pig numbers as fast as we can to keep it from spreading. And y'all, I will tell you right now, the feds are already having the conversation about trying to invoke emergency powers to suspend private property rights to go kill pigs, if that happens. I've also been in rooms and told them that's a bad idea. But the point is, if you're proactive in removing pigs from the landscape, that disease spread would be slowed and we would have a chance to get it under control rather than a connected landscape where one pig's going to find another and it's going to rip through it quickly. There's new things all the time. Pigs are an emerging issue that seems like every time we turn around, they're coming up with something new for us. So I wanted to take the time today to talk about chemical control measures, where we are, what's up and coming, but also the issues that we're seeing. So in chemical control, remember, sodium nitrite is still being worked on, but it's kind of on hold right now. Kaput has a label in Texas. It's the only state I know of so far that's labeled it, and we're expecting to see that product to end users around April. The Extension Service, we're putting together materials to educate folks on best practices for application. And that material is going to go out in a training tomorrow to extension agents so they can start preparing, doing community level outreach on the best ways to apply this product from all the research that we did over the last few years. So with that being said, I really appreciate your time. Jared, we're really running up on 1 o'clock pretty tight, so I'm not sure we've got time for questions. If you want to hop on, buddy, and pick one or two, they're in the chat, I can answer quickly. That'd be fine.